Hello, everyone. I see that we've got 11 o'clock here on the calendar, or on the, excuse me, on the clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started on today's webinar. So hello and welcome to the Evaluating the Critical Factors of Soybean Yield webinar today. My name is Rachel Peabody, and I'm our Director of Communications at the Illinois Soybean Association. Today, we'd like to thank our corporate sponsor, BASF, for sponsoring this webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure we answer those during the presentation. There will also be 4 poll questions for the audience to answer during the presentation today, so be sure to interact with those as they become available. I also want to let the viewers know that there will be a short survey following the conclusion of the webinar. And if you're a certified crop advisor, please be sure to fill that out with your name and CCA number, and you'll get your 1 CEU in crop management available for attending today's webinar. Please refer to the chat box for some announcements from BASF, including a link to their Illinois virtual showcase plot, the Zetavo soybean seed, and Credin soybean brand. These resources will be included in a follow-up email as well to all attendees, so watch your email today too. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker today, Greg Urey. Greg is a BASF seed agronomist in Illinois. He grew up in the southern part of the state on a family farm, raising soybeans, corn, cattle, and hogs. He has a degree in agronomy from Murray State University and a master's in agronomy from the University of Illinois. He's been a CCA since 1999. He's worked in various roles in the ag industry over his last 24 years, and he works with growers on implementing new practices to improve production in corn and soybeans. Today, Greg will be presenting the Evaluating the Critical Factors for Soybean Yield, which will dive into what those critical factors are, including planting date, fertility, seed treatments, fungicide applications, and how all of that impacts yield in soybeans. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's expert, Greg Urey.
Thank you, Rachel, and we'll go ahead and get started on this. So again, my name is Greg Urey. What we're going to talk about today are some of the things that we've evaluated over the last few years at BASF to become, or that we look at as being extremely critical factors when we talk about soybean yields. So soybean yields, it obviously takes managing a lot of different factors. So oftentimes we're going to look at things, or we think, okay, what can I add? What's this one thing I can do to maybe boost my yields and get into that 80 to 100 bushel range? And realistically, there isn't anything. I think we look at it similar to the way I look at weight loss program. I'm constantly looking for that magic pill that I can take, and I don't have to change anything about my diet or my habits to be able to lose weight. And that's just not realistic, right? It takes looking at what we've done in the past, things that have worked for us, understanding some of our limiting factors, and being willing to change and put a little bit of time and effort into looking at what we need to change to bring yield to it. But realistically, increasing soybean yields is about managing a lot of different factors, right? It's all a whole big old web of things that go into what makes up yield. So how do we get more yield? I think this is critical. I want to talk about the yield components and everything we need that we do. We need to think about how does this positively impact one of these 3 or all 3 of these yield components. So I look at yield is made up of number of pods per acre. So how do we get more pods per acre harvested? Number of seeds per pod. It's about maximizing the number of seeds that we can get in each pod, and then weight of seeds. So are there management practices, or are there things that we can do that we see can increase seed weight throughout the season? So as I go through this, I'm sure there's things that I've done that have worked well for me. That may or may not work for you guys. There's probably some things that I haven't had as much success with that you might see. But as I go through, I like to talk about what we've done, what's been successful for us, and not only look at the yield data, but also try to dive into why is it working, what's behind the scene, what's from a physiological standpoint, why is it bringing yield to the table. So I'd like to start the first question off and look at, what factors do you think have the biggest impact on yield? just trying to get a poll on the group that's on this call today. So as we're waiting on the poll question to come in, I see it's finally here. Good. It looks like we have a pretty wide range of answers, but the number one answer was planting date. I'd say that definitely has a very big impact. Variety selection. I like where we're going. As we go through, I think you'll see that I agree with pretty much all of these answers. I do think that planting date has historically been probably the biggest driver. And again, we're going to talk in and dive into the whys we're seeing it. So the key to increasing yield is putting ourselves in position for success, right? And it's about managing a lot of different factors. So planting date is definitely one of the keys that sets us up for yield. Variety selection, extremely important. Revitec Fastback, I'm going to show you some data that we've done and some of those things we've been able to see value that we've gotten from the fungicide insecticide applications. Row spacing, seed and seeding rate, seed treatment, plant nutrients, and residual herbicides or weed management. But ultimately, the goal is to be able to maximize yield, but not only maximize yield, but do it in the most economic manner. So realizing which factors or which inputs that are bringing yield to it, and those are the ones that we want to spend money on and continue to do. So again, like we said, building a high yield system really starts with planting date. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, but we have to start off and get that factory going to start with. So I'd like to ask another question. If weather permits, when do you like to start planting soybeans? Okay, good. Looks like majority of the people want to plant in April and primarily early April. There's a few people that will plant in March, and some of us, some people are still are wanting to plant in May. So pretty good range. At least nobody answered late May, and I think that is definitely the right answer. So let's start into some of the things that we've seen and the whys. So why is planting date so important? So one thing we know about soybeans is that they are light harvesters, and they're not as efficient of a photosynthetic factor as what we have with corn, right? So there's limitations. They're source limited. They need light at certain times. They don't have the same growth. So one of the goals that we have to do is how do we build that photosynthetic factory? So I look at this whole thing as being a photosynthetic factory. How do we build that sooner in the year to where we can capture and maximize the amount of sunlight that we have? So when we look at this picture, we look at our April 12th planting versus our May 11th planting. And you think about when are we going to be able to get the most sunlight? It's going to be at that first day of summer during the longest days of the year. How do we do that? Planting date definitely has an impact on that. So we're able to get that plant up and going quicker to be able to utilize and capture more sunlight. So more canopy photosynthesis and utilize the solar radiation better during critical growth periods. So another thing, when do we need to maximize sunlight? Or when you think about a plant, when is an extremely critical time is in that R1 to R2 stage. So if we can have a bigger plant out there, we're into that R1, R2, R3 stage during that first day of summer, we see that can have a definite positive impact on yield. outside of just solar radiation and building a bigger photosynthetic factory, some other values that we've seen from planting data is we do see that we can increase number of main stem nodes. So that's important when we think about pod set is on nodes. And if we have more nodes, we have more opportunity for pod set as well. We've also seen that we can influence reproductive stages. So historically, we've always thought that reproductive stage is going to start around that first day of summer, right? Summer solstice is kind of that trigger to start the flowering process. But we've seen that in cases when we plant early April or even March, maybe we can move that flowering time up to early June, possibly even into late May on some years, depending upon the heat. And also, we've seen that we extend the duration of vegetative and reproductive stages to give us a longer growing season to be able to maximize yield as well. So what do we think we knew, what did we think we knew about planting dates? So growing up and even I'd say many years into my career, I always said, you know what, we need to plant beans when the soils are warm. We know that the first 24 hours that seed imbibes water, and we want that first drink of water to be a warmer drink. As that water or the soil temperatures start dipping down below 50, we've always been told, you know, there's potentially some physiological damage that can occur that's irreversible, and we can't really do anything about it in the future. So warmer planting dates, planting into soils warmer than 50 degrees, and giving them that first drink that's warm was always critical. So we dove into that and we started looking at this in 2016. So what influence do we have from cold weather, from planting into cool weather? Is there truly a big yield issue or physiological damage that's occurring? So 2016, we were able to get out on our first planting date, March 21st, and the 24-hour soil temperature was 37.7 degrees. So well below that 50 degree range. We were able to get 88% of the plants out of the ground. Compared to the April 18th, where we planted and the soil temperatures were at 57.5 degrees, we were able to get over 90%. So I think when you look at this, based on everything that we thought we knew, we would say that without a doubt, the April planting date would be better. But when we took it to yield, we saw things that kind of went against what we'd always really thought were true. This was the first year that we were able to obtain 100 bushel beans at the farm here at Seymour. And we pretty much saw a stair step to planting date. So it kind of makes you back up and think, okay, how much influence does cold weather have on final yield, or are there other factors there that may have a greater influence? So 2017 came along, and anytime you do research, obviously you're trying to push that envelope. You want to break the system to see how far you can take something. Otherwise, you really don't know what your potentials are. So we were able to get in February. We had some soils that were dry enough to get in, start some planting dates. March came along, and we had some snows. We had some extremely cold weathers. We were measuring soil temperatures dipping down to 30 degrees. Actually, days when the soils were so froze that we weren't even able to get a soil thermometer into the ground to be able to measure. So extremely cold weather after our February planting date, and finally reached emergence on April 10th. So if you look at that, it took us 50 days to get those March beans or the February beans out of the ground. And we only had a final stand of 49%. So I think that as a whole, we would say, yeah, we probably broke the system. 49% final stands, not what we would consider to be adequate. Even our early March beans, we only ended up with a 60% stand. So again, below what we probably think is where we want to be. But it was a cold weather that caused that, or was there something else? Because when we look at our late March planted beans, that was the coldest day that we planted, right? It was 35 degree soil temperatures, and we were still able to get 83% final stand. So what did the yield look like that year? So again, you remember we talked about the February planting date, and it took 50 days to get out of the ground, and we only had right at a 50% stand, and it was one of our highest yields that we had that whole year. So that really makes you think, okay, how much does cold weather affect us if we aren't out of the ground? And can we start planting earlier to start building that photosynthetic factory sooner? I'm not advocating that we get out in February and start planting, but it does show that beans are a lot more resilient and can adapt to some early challenges that maybe we didn't think they could early on. So 2018 came along, and I think we all remember it was an extremely cool early spring. We started our planting date trial on March 22nd, where we were looking at comparing 15-inch rows versus 30-inch rows. And then came along March 25th, 3 days later, we caught another snow. What's significant about March 25th in 2018 was that was Easter Sunday. And I think a lot of us know the wise tale that if you have rain on Easter Sunday, you'll have rain for the next 7 Sundays. Well, we were hoping that we wouldn't have snow on Easter Sunday and have snow for the next 7 Sundays. But the way it turned out, we had snow for the next 3 Sundays anyway. So our March planted beans, we had 4 snows on them. We had the coldest or second coldest April in history. And that had a definite impact on emergence and early growth. What set the stage, though, for 2018, I think a lot of us would agree that 2018 was one of the highest yielding years that we'd ever seen. Definitely the state average was the highest in history. And the thing that set the stage for that was the warm May that we had. So we had a record temperature, record warm May that was able to get our plants and everything up growing to build that photosynthetic factory that we talked about earlier. So let's look at the March beans. We planted them into 34-degree temperatures, took 40 days to come out of the ground. April 23rd was the next planting date we had, only took 11 days to come out of the ground. That means that our March 22nd beans only emerged 2 days earlier than our April 23rd beans. So if you think about that, I guess in retrospect, we would think, well, definitely there will be a big yield difference. The March beans can't be as good as the April beans in this scenario. And when we saw that, basically we had equal yields. And still the March 22nd, even with 4 snows on it, taking 40 days to get out of the ground, we're still better than our late April and our mid-May beans. So again, planting date had an impact on yield. Along came 2019, and I think we all remember that whether you wanted to plant in March or not, you probably weren't going to. Really, we only had one opportunity to even go across any of the fields in April, and that was on the 17th, and probably was one thing that we're not extremely proud of, or you wouldn't want to be bragging about it and showing a lot of pictures, because it was definitely not ideal soil conditions when we were out there. Having challenges getting seed trench closed in places because it was so wet. But we wanted to get this planting date in so we could look at it. We ended up with about a 70% emergence on our April beans, but our next planting date that we had wasn't until May 17th. So as we looked at that and we start looking at yield, even under less than ideal planting conditions, that month difference did show us an advantage again in 2019. So the first 4 years, we saw big advantages to that earlier planting date, and along came 2020. And I think I'm going to leave it, I'll start out like this. I doubt if any of us forget this year very fast. I bet last New Year's Eve, when we rolled the calendar over to 220, we were ready to forget about 2019. And I bet when we rolled the calendar over this New Year's Eve and rolled into 2021, we were ready to forget about 2020 as well. So what happened in 2020? I think the one that the world will remember is, the coronavirus, right? The pandemic that shut the world down. A lot of challenges, whether directly impacted you or not, there was an impact to all of our lives. It's changed the way we do things. I don't know that probably half of us had never even heard of Zoom until we started into this year, and now that's kind of a part of life that we have to deal with is doing these kind of calls by Zoom or webinar. What I remember though, and what I think I will remember for a long time is the freeze that we had on Mother's Day. So we had an opportunity to plant a lot of beans or some beans in March, but a lot of beans were planted in that first week of April. And we had beans that were cracking the ground and basically unifoliate to first trifoliate showing in a lot of different fields. And we were getting weather reports saying that we were going to dip down into the mid 20s. So at Seymour, we went out and we put thermometers out in the field to evaluate temperature to see how that would impact the plants. And what we found was that the May 9th temperatures, we were down at 27 degrees for an hour and 45 minutes. If you would have told me we were going to get that cold at that time, I would have said, well, we're probably going to lose every plant. The reality is we did lose some plants, and I know there were some fields that had to be replanted, but as a whole, a lot of these plants were able to survive and continue on. We did see some cases where we had some of the growth that was dead atop, but we were still able to maintain healthy cotyledons. And then we started seeing new growth shoot out of those cotyledons, so our auxiliary buds starting to kick in and the plant continuing to grow. When we look at yield this year, I would say it somewhat mirrors the 2017 yield. As a whole, April was equal to May. And that's probably true across the state. I've talked to people that said, yeah, my May beans are better than my April beans. I've talked to people that said my April beans were still better than my May beans. On this particular plot, I will tell you, I think the biggest impact was maybe not the cold weather as much as it was the amount of water that we had. So we had 5 inches of rain from the time we planted the April 20th plot until May 11th. And I think that had as much impact as anything because we saw stand issues, we saw some early emergence issues, and some root rot issues as well. On a different part of the farm where we were better drained, and we had an April 7th planting date versus a May 11th planting date, the April 7th planting date was still 5 bushel better than our May. So I think the cold weather did have some impact, but the reason I think this trial is showing what it was on one of the more poorly drained areas of the farm. I think it is as much about water impact as it was its cold and temperature impact. When we look at the trend on the 5-year trend, so only 3 years were we able to get out and plant in March, and we saw that our March beans, 2 out of those 3 years were the highest yielding beans we had, and 2018 it was slightly below our April planting. But what we do notice is as we get into late April and we start delaying planting, maybe past April 20th, April 25th, we start seeing some yield loss per day. So it's about 1/1500th of a bushel per day that we're seeing. And if you look at that from a $10 bushel price over about 1,000 acres, that's $1,500 per day we're potentially losing by delaying planting. Now, the dramatic or the bigger increase or decrease that we're seeing is when we start delaying into May. And when we have a 4/10 of a bushel loss per day at $10 beans, that adds up really quick. When you look at it across 1,000 acres, that's potentially $4,000 a day that we're giving up by not planting. So, obviously there's challenges, there's environmental challenges that maybe we can or can't get in to plant as early as we'd like. I guess my takeaway from this is there's definitely an impact, a positive impact by being able to plant earlier, get that plant up earlier. And the key is to be ready to plant, be able to plant when the soil conditions and the weather allow us to be able to maximize yield. So we have looked at this in corn as well. Now we want to talk a little bit about more of the whys are we seeing an impact on yield. At the farm at Seymour, where we've seen our highest yielding corn yields have typically been from our early May planting date. Versus in soybeans, we see kind of a downward trend as we delay any of it. So there's a bigger yield penalty as well as economic penalty by delaying our soybean planting versus our corn planting. And I want to talk a little bit about why is that. I think all of us understand that soybeans or that corn needs to emerge at the same time. We need every plant coming up at the same time in order to maximize yield. If we have delays in emergence timing at harvest, we end up having spindly plants with nubbins on them or maybe even nothing on there. And those plants, all they do is compete for sunlight and moisture and nutrients all year long without bringing any yield value. Well, we looked at beans as well, and we've seen that we can have up to 5 to 6 days difference in emergence without having a yield hit or a significant yield hit. The other thing is, if we had a 70% stand in corn, we're probably replanting. That's not going to be adequate amount of plants out there to maximize yield. And we've seen if we have 70% stand in beans, oftentimes that really has very little impact on yield. We also looked at it from a canopy closure standpoint and trying to understand, okay, how does planting date and row spacing impact canopy closure? So in 2017, we looked at our April 13th and our May 18th planting dates at 15-inch row beans, and we saw that on summer solstice, or the longest day of the year, we have 75% canopy closure on our 15-inch beans planted in April, and only 32% at that time on our May planted beans. When we compare that to 30-inch rows, April planted beans were at 40% versus May planted beans at 12%. So you can definitely see that planting date has an impact on canopy closure, as well as row spacing has an impact. So we talked about 2018, and why did we see that 2018 was historically the highest yielding year in the state? A lot of it, I believe, was driven by this. So we looked at our April planting beans, and we measured 15-inch rows, saw that 85% canopy closure versus only 75% in 2017. But our May planted beans, 64% versus 32%. So that May time frame, we were able to get a significant amount more growth to get us up and going quicker. Same thing at our 30-inch rows, 53% versus 36%, way more than what we saw in 2017. So a year where we were able to capture more sunlight and be more efficient. Another area that we've seen that has a positive influence on yield by planting date is duration of growing season. And we started looking at, okay, what stages are we seeing that are changing? So I think all of us have seen times where we've planted maybe end of April and end of May, a month apart from each other with the same variety. And we noticed that at harvest, there's not a month difference in maturity. So where are those later planted beans? Where are they making up that ground, or where's that season shortening for them? We looked at the vegetative stages, and we'd say that April versus May, there was very little difference there. So basically the same amount of time that we stayed in the vegetative stage, so not changing that as a whole. We looked at the late reproductive stage, and we'd say, those are essentially the same too. So we're really not changing the growing season in the late side either. Where we saw the most significant change, though, was in the early reproductive stage, primarily that year in R2 or full flower. So our April planted beans were able to stay in R2 and continue to flower and put more flowers on for a significant amount more days, 8 more days than our later May planted beans, giving us more chance to put flowers on, which end up being more potential for pods as well. Another thing we've seen, and we talk about those critical yield factors and how do we get more pods. One thing we can do is increasing nodes. So we were able to go out in our planting date trials and hand harvest 60 plants in each planting date trial and count yield and look at the yield components by planting date. What we noticed was as we planted later, we ended up seeing fewer total main stem nodes. So planting date had a very big impact on final main stem nodes. If you look at our April 13th versus our May 18th, over 2.5 more nodes on average for the April 13th. You put that over 100,000 beans out there, that's 250,000 more nodes that we have per acre to potentially put pods on. What we didn't see a difference in, or what we didn't see planting date have any impact on, was seeds per pod. So essentially, the number of seeds per pod were the same between that 2.5 to 2.6 seeds per pod. So why are we able to see changes, or what's changed over the last 15, 20 years? I think that's probably made the biggest impact, allow us to do this. I do believe one of the factors is genetics. I see varieties that are coming out of the ground better. I think emergence is better, and I think early season vigor is better. So there's definitely a change in breeding and the genetics that we have. But probably the biggest impact is the seed treatment. We've looked at planting date trials with and without seed treatment, and I would highly recommend that we don't go out and start planting in March and early April if we're not treating beans. Now, we don't see dramatic results every year or every trial, but as a whole, there's times where we have an adequate stand where we treat and a no stand where we didn't treat. We want to look at fungicides that are going to give us maximum protection for Pythium, Phytophthora, Rhizoc, Fusarium. Also, some of our seed treatments today that we have on there help with different environmental stresses. So being able to endure some of the cooler stresses that we have early on. Also, we think about some of the diseases that we have. So sudden death, is that a potential problem? I know that we've always thought, early planting beans have a higher risk of sudden death. And with the addition of Allevo, we're able to see that maybe we can somewhat minimize that, and insecticides too. So one issue that we have seen show up if we plant extremely early before a lot of other people is potentially a higher risk of bean leaf beetle pressure early on. So having those seed treatments out there to help us be able to handle those problems have been very beneficial as well. So what additional soybean factors do we have other than planting date that we've seen definitely drive soybean yield? So I think variety selection is very, very important. I'm going to open it up. I want to ask you guys, what do you feel are the most important factors when you look at selecting soybean varieties? All right, I would say that we are about as much on the same page as possible. 49% of the poll says yield potential is the number one thing, disease package being second, adaptability to soil being third, and herbicide tolerance being last. So when I look at what factors I think are the most important thing to look at when we're selecting varieties, I definitely think genetic yield potential is number one. We can't maximize yield if we don't have a variety that has the yield potential that we need. Also, we need to make sure that the variety we have has the right disease package, right? So do we have a higher risk of Phytophthora or sudden death? Has white mold been an issue? Maybe we need a variety that's going to be able to handle that. But making sure that we have the right disease package out there is critical as well. Adaptability to your soil. So are you in a tight, wet clay? Or are you in a more of a droughty clay or a sandy soil? So can it handle the soils, and can it handle the stress? Does it have the drought tolerance that you need? Does it have the soil moisture tolerance? So can it handle the wet feet that you have potentially in your field? A couple other things I look at. So early season emergence and vigor. As we planted earlier, and we start looking, there's definitely some varieties that tend to be able to come out of the ground a little bit quicker and have a little bit better vigor to get that early start. Also standability. If we have a soil or a field that's had historical standability issues and lodging may be an issue, we want to make sure we get a variety that's going to be able to adapt to that. And I think last to me is herbicide tolerance. And this one's probably changed a little bit of where we place this one over the last few years. If we go back 2-3 years ago, herbicide tolerance was probably the first thing we had to talk about, because we had to understand what herbicide tolerant variety wanted before we could really start talking about the rest of these things. With today's world that we're in, and the fact that we have 3 new traits that have come out within the last 3 years that are all triple stack traits, whether it be LLGT27, Enlist E3s, or Extend Flex, they all three share two common herbicide tolerances, and that's Liberty and glyphosate. So what I believe we can do, and I think that there's a lot of people I've talked to that agree that, maybe herbicide tolerance isn't as important. We're going to get one of those three traits and treat them all the same. Really what we want to look at is these factors that truly have an impact on yield, that influence yield. Yeah, if there's cases where, hey, I have certain weeds that I have to have a certain one of the other herbicides that I can't, that I don't feel like Liberty or glyphosate is going to control, then maybe we have to move this one up. But as a whole, if we put together a good herbicide program with Liberty and glyphosate being our post options and utilizing residuals, then we can start opening up the option to have the ability to look at more varieties to give us more opportunities to maximize yield. So I wanted to try to figure out a way to look at the difference between yield potential and varieties. And what I've done here, it's a little bit confusing. I'll try to explain it the best I can, but I've taken the last 10 years of university variety trials, and I went in and year by year broke out each of the 5 regions and looked at the highest yielding variety in the region and the lowest yielding variety in the region to see what the difference is between highest and lowest yielding beans. I've taken that and averaged that across a 10-year period, and what I've seen is the difference between the highest yielding bean and the lowest yielding bean was 18.7 bushel on average. At $10 beans, that's $187 per acre potentially difference. Now, obviously, when we're selecting varieties, we're shooting to not be down here at the lowest. But then I thought, okay, what about the highest yielding versus the test mean? And that came in at about 7.9 bushels. So, pretty significant difference in what the variety selection can do for us, making sure we get the right varieties. I think everybody's goal is to be able to get varieties that are going to be above average, right? When we start selecting when we start utilizing or thinking, hey, I've got to look at this certain herbicide tolerant or this certain herbicide tolerance, it definitely limits the choices we have to look at. So if we open up and we think, okay, I can look at all of them, our options are much greater. And the fact is, all traits have very high yielding varieties that are going to perform very well, and all traits have lower yielding varieties. I looked at the 2020 OVTs, and in every trait that we basically know that we use, won at least one region. So all of them can yield. We just have to make sure we get the right ones and select the right varieties. So I thought, okay, what's that mean? And how do we go about selecting it? What value does it have when we look at this? So I've kind of I've got 3 varieties that I've tested a lot across the state. I looked at the average yield across all environments. So if I just said, okay, I want to know which one's the highest yielding on average across all environments, I'm not worried about any of the other agronomics. Obviously, variety C would be the one we would choose because it was the highest yielding. It was essentially a bushel better than variety B and a little over a bushel better than variety A. The reality is not all fields are the same, and we do have different challenges across the way. So we need to understand not just the overall top-end yield or the yield potential, but also how do the agronomics play into it. If we would have said, okay, I want all variety C, but I have a lot of drought-prone, stressier soils, we would have potentially put ourselves in a pretty big hole, right? Variety C was the worst on the drought tolerance, and variety A, which overall average was the lowest, was the best. What we see is variety A is able to handle a lot of different soils and is very consistent. So if you had a lot of variability, variety A may be the best. If we had a lot of top-end yields, so if we have those flat black soils, then variety C would be the one that we would have wanted, places where we didn't have water limiting issues. So understanding yield potential, but also understanding the environments and the agronomics that the varieties bring to be able to get the right variety in the right acre will help with maximizing yield. So the next one I'm going to talk about is protecting our yield components. And I would say, so I kind of started out the conversation as I look for that weight loss pill, the magic pill that I can take where it's kind of a silver bullet. And I would say if there's anything that's as close to a silver bullet as that I've seen, it is a fungicide insecticide application in protecting these yield components. Remember, we want to increase or protect one of three of these. And this is one of the few things that I can tell you, we can actually increase all three of these. So we can influence all three yield components. So what do we need to know? I think it's critical that we understand what nodes are providing the majority of the soybean yield. So we've looked at plants with 2022 total nodes, and we've seen that 80 to 85% of our yield is coming between node 5 and node 16. So we have to protect these nodes if we're going to maximize yield. We talk about applying at R3. And if you think about the beans that we have, indeterminate beans, if we're applying at R3, this is about the stage that we're out there hitting. So we're able to protect the beans that are the leaves, the nodal leaves that are going to be the ones that drive yield. So why is it so important to protect all of the nodal leaves and not just the upper nodal leaves? So we know that pods are set at nodes, and each individual node is where we have potential to have more pods set. Each one of these nodal leaves are what feed the node and the pods at that node. So if we are losing these nodal leaves, if we aren't protecting them, and for some reason disease or whatever, we're losing these nodal leaves, that's impacting or potentially limiting the amount of total pods that we can have at each node. We'll be aborting more pods, or if we aren't aborting, we're at least going to be minimizing the final seed weight of each one of those beans. So the AST team that I'm on across the Midwest a couple years ago, we set out to say, okay, do we see a difference in variety response to fungicide? We were curious to see if there were some varieties that maybe really didn't show a response, and maybe some that showed huge response. And reality is, yes, there's differences in response, but at the end of the day, I can't sit here and say that I saw a single variety that didn't show a response, or even I would say every variety showed a economic response to a fungicide. So again, I go back to, if there's one thing that I say is a silver bullet, applying a Revitec Fast Act or a fungicide insecticide at R3 has seemed to be that one. So I also looked at, and I wanted to break down and look at how did each individual site that I tested at this year perform. And overall, I had 7 sites. Overall, I had a 5.1 bushel advantage where I treated with Revitec versus Fast Act, or Revitec Fast Act versus the untreated check. Where did I get that yield? Because I can tell you that as a whole, we didn't have a lot of disease this year. It's pretty obvious and easy to understand that you get a big response when you have a lot of foliar disease. But reality is, we really didn't have a lot of foliar disease. Where I got it was from the plant health standpoint, and be able to mitigate stress and minimize the impact that stress had on the plants. Areas in trials that we saw the greatest advantage. So at DeKalb, that was one of the areas where we had probably a little bit more drought stress than some of the other areas. And we saw bigger responses at areas where we had more stress. So why is that? And again, I talked about, obviously fungicides are going to be bringing disease tolerance, but also there's secondary benefits that we see from plant health products too, from the standpoint of late season plant health and being able to stay green longer. So we've looked at the BASF plant health and what it does from an environmental stress in the greenhouse versus competitive products. And what you'll see is, as the plant's stressed, the fungicides with the BASF plant health are able to maintain growth more efficiently. Not to say that stress doesn't affect them, but they're at least able to maintain a little bit more growth than we see with other fungicides. We've done that with multiple crops, and we see very similar results. So it's pretty common where we have stress left unmanaged that we see this. So yield can come from managing stress, whether it's insect stress, disease stress, environmental stresses. What we want to mitigate or limit is how many pods we end up aborting, and try to keep as many of those on the plant as possible. Another thing I've looked at was late season gains from seed weight. And as we look at how do we increase seed weight, it takes about 2 milligrams increase per seed to increase 1 bushel. 2 milligrams is not much. A $1 bill equals 1,000 milligrams. And the way we're doing that is by decreasing grain fill stress and maintaining photosynthetic longer. So I looked at 3 different trials at Seymour this year, and we had 76 head-to-head comparisons where we treated our beans with Revitec Fastback. We saw an average of 5.6 milligrams heavier seed than where we did not treat, which came up to a 2.8 bushel yield advantage, just strictly from late season plant health and seed weight. So throw this question up real quick, see what everybody's thinking, where they're at as far as moving forward with fungicide this year. So it looks like majority of the people are planning on doing it with a few no's and a few undecideds, but it is good to see that majority is still is looking to do that. I'm going to roll through these last few things pretty quick because we're getting short on time. But what we've seen from population and row spacing is, on average, population doesn't seem to be as much of an influence on yield as what we've seen from row spacing. We've seen really good results from row spacing, being able to get canopy quicker. It goes back to maximizing sunlight. The narrower rows have shown about a 4.6 bushel yield advantage over 30-inch rows. Talk about plant nutrition. I think this is the one where a lot of times we look for that silver bullet, and it's probably the most complex part of soybean management that I deal with. But when we think about plant nutrition, typically we think soil fertility. And when I think about soil fertility in soybeans, pH is probably my number one thing I'm going to look at. pH has a huge influence over availability of all nutrients. It also has a very big influence over biology and what's going on from a microbial standpoint. And we look at soybean production. It takes about 4 pounds of nitrogen per pound to 4 pounds of nitrogen per bushel for soybeans. So an 80 bushel soybean crop takes about 320 pounds of nitrogen to raise, and very few of us are putting nitrogen on to be able to do it. So where are we getting it? It's coming from the microbes, either through nitrogen fixation or through mineralization and from the decomposition of residue and organic matter to be able to get. The other component, and I think this one really has an impact on all things, is the physical side. So you have the uncontrollable side, the soil texture, organic matter. We're not going to change those. It's a very important part. We see that when we think about value of land, that's a big part of what we look at. There's also the controllable part. Here's where we need to focus on is drainage and soil structure. So anything that we can do to improve drainage or soil structure and reduce compaction will help that plant be able to grow larger roots. So we've seen where saturated soils or compacted soils limit root growth and development. Also, we know that as we're in saturated soils, our microbial activity slows down too. From a fertility standpoint, if there are a few things I would say that we're seeing becoming more commonly used and seeing a greater response, would be sulfur. As a whole, sulfur is becoming one of the most rapidly growing deficient nutrients that we see year in drought. We aren't getting the rain or the sulfur from acid rains like we used to, and We're seeing a greater response more often with the application of sulfur. Weed control. Obviously, weed control is not getting necessarily any easier. We have a lot of options out there, but it seems like every time we do something, we continue to find more resistance issues. So weed resistance, species shift. Earlier planting can have an impact on making weed management a little bit more challenging, a longer time from the time we plant until we get full canopy to close the rows. Workload management, wider rows, we see a lot of 30-inch rows, and herbicide application restrictions. But to me, really, when I think about weed management, it's really about building a comprehensive plan with effective tools. And it's start clean, it's utilize residuals, pre-plant residuals with multiple modes of actions that are fit to target the weed challenges that you have. It's coming back with our in-season post-application, targeting smaller weeds, 2 to 3 inch weeds, and overlaying additional residuals to be able to help get us through there too. So a few closing thoughts I want to run through here. I think the key is know the pros and cons of what you're doing in your operation. Are there things that are working? Are there things that maybe you can change? What can't we control? We don't control the weather. There's nothing we can do about whether it's raining or it's hot. What can we control though? And these are the areas we need to really focus in on, are the controllables that we have. Ultimately, we need to work on building strategies to maximize canopy photosynthesis. Those are the things that are going to lead to more yield. And it's about agronomics plus crop management to equal success. At the end of the day, we know there's a lot of yield potential left on the table every year. We see this year, I think we had 190 plus bushel beans be a new world record. So I can tell you that I've never been close to 190 bushels. So there's obviously opportunity for me to continue to look for more yield. And I think that's probably the case with most of you guys as well. I want to finish by saying thank you and open it up to any questions that you guys might have.
Great. Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Greg. We're now going to begin taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will try to get to as many as we can. The first question I have for you, Greg, in your planting date trials, what were the seed treatments?
Yeah, so in the planting date trials, from a fungicide standpoint, what we tried to do is have the maximum amount of rates to be able to get maximum disease control. But we had a fungicide insecticide plus Alevo on pretty much all of them. The fungicide insecticides may have changed from year to year. Alevo was one thing that we consistently had across all of them.
Okay, and also on the application of fungicide and insecticide, what growth stage were you applying at?
Yeah, good question. So typically what I target is R3. If we're looking at just one timing, I want to make sure I kind of err on the side of fully being into R3, maybe even pushing closer to R4, unless I have a year where I see a lot of disease coming in. If we have a lot of disease coming in, we might want to push it a little earlier. But what I've found in my trials is if there's not a lot of disease out there, pushing that closer to that R4 stage gives me more benefit during that late seed fill and really helps from that maintaining holding on to pods and seed weight.
Great. If in a 50-50 rotation, are we compromising our yield potential versus multiple years continuous corn prior to beans?
So I think the question is if are we yielding less in a 50-50? So if we rotate corn beans every year versus having a corn on corn then coming into beans, and I would say that as a whole, your corn on corn and then coming into beans, so you've been out of beans for a while, you probably have less potential disease pressure out there. So you probably end up you probably do have a little bit more yield potential where you've been corn for a long time, but that's just because of less disease pressure. On the flip side of that, I would say if I've been in corn for a long time, we didn't talk a lot about it, but I wanted to start thinking about the value or the need to put inoculants on too, because as you've been out of soybeans for a while, your rhizobia population may start to decrease, and the inoculants, putting that rhizobia back in there to help feed that plant with nitrogen is extremely critical.
Okay. Does it pay to inoculate beans?
Yeah, good question. I kind of just talked about that. So yes, in the right situation. I can't say that I've seen consistent data that says we should inoculate every single acre. Like I kind of talked about before, if I've been out of soybeans for a while, I think inoculations are a must. I definitely think that we'll see a very high percentage of the time we're going to have a increase in yield. Other areas where I do believe we'll have increases, possibly some sandy soils, definitely soils that have been flooded. So if you had some bottom ground or acres that were flooded, obviously back in 2019, we had a lot of acres that were flooded. Those are areas where we might be able to see or have a higher likelihood of seeing a positive influence from that. Those are challenging environments on the biological side. Other areas where we had fallow ground, so where we didn't get anything planted and we just had fallow ground out there all year, it's another area where it's very difficult or challenging to our biological components.
Okay. Do you have a planting condition rating? While I expect it more in corn, I wonder if it's the same as soybeans.
Yeah, so I think conditions are a little bit more forgiving in soybeans. I know conditions are more forgiving in soybeans than they are in corn. I try not to go out and mud beans in. I definitely don't want to be out in late March and early April putting beans in the mud. So we try to have marginally dry conditions, I think is what I'd say. But as a whole, I do feel like the conditions are probably, you're probably a little bit more flexible with soybeans than you are corn. So if I guess my way I always look at it is, if you're out there planting corn and you're sitting here asking yourself, should I be doing this? The answer is you probably shouldn't be. In that situation, you'd probably be better off planting your beans in those conditions than you would be corn, just because of the forgiveness, or there's more forgiveness in maybe a reduced stand, or maybe a less uniform emergence with soybeans.
Okay, next question. Do lower populations help much with lodging?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question too. So they can, yeah. So if you get low enough, they can. If you truly have an issue with lodging in a field, I would probably say let's try to find the right variety, because a bean that has a problem with lodging, yeah, if we go from 140 down to maybe 90, that's going to help, but you could potentially obviously give up yield too. So I think the answer is yes. Population does have an influence. We don't want to get really high. If we get up into that 160 range, we're definitely going to lodge. But if lodging truly is your number one concern, maybe we should look at, and we have a bean that's can stand a little better, it might be the better direction to go.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. Any results or thoughts on 20-inch beans?
Yeah, so we don't have a 20-inch row planter, so we don't do a ton of work with that. But everything that I've seen from 20-inch rows, I would expect to be very similar to the same as what I've seen with 15-inch rows. So, the data I showed was 15-inch rows, but if you have a 20-inch row planter and that's what you're using for corn and beans, I think that you will see very similar results as what I saw with what we've seen with 15-inch rows as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions today. I want to take a moment to thank Greg for his informative presentation today, and thank you to our corporate sponsor, BASF, for sponsoring today's webinar. There will be a short survey for all attendees following the conclusion of the webinar. It will open up into a browser window. So if for some reason it doesn't pop up, don't worry. It will also be included in a follow-up email to all attendees. One more reminder to CCAs to please provide your name and CCA number in the survey so that we can submit your information to receive the CEU offered today. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you all have a great day.